Welcome to Book 2, where we bring the timeless literature of the public domain to life through immersive audio experiences. From Jane Austen to Charles Dickens, William Shakespeare to Mark Twain, we bring you the most beloved classic books, now free to access and enjoy, read by beautiful AI voices. So sit back, relax, and let us transport you to a world of timeless stories and enduring characters, all available for free. Subscribe now and never miss an episode of Classic Books Audio. You are listening to The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. The first chapter of Civilizing Huck, from The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, is an introduction to the main character, Huck Finn, and his background. The chapter begins by describing Huck's upbringing, which was marked by poverty and neglect. He lived with his father, who was an abusive and alcoholic, and had no mother. Huck is described as being wild and uneducated, and he spends most of his time roaming around the countryside. The chapter then goes on to describe Huck's encounter with Miss Watson, a wealthy widow who takes Huck in and tries to civilize him. She starts by teaching him how to read and write, and tries to instill in him the values of religion and proper manners. Huck finds these lessons to be tedious and uninteresting, and he struggles to understand the point of them. Throughout the chapter, Huck is described as being resistant to Miss Watson's attempts to change him. He finds her lessons to be boring and unimportant, and he is more interested in the freedom and adventure of life on the Mississippi River. This desire for freedom and adventure is a recurring theme in the novel, and it sets the stage for Huck's eventual journey down the river with Jim, a runaway slave. In Chapter 2 titled The Boy's Escape, Huck and his friend, Tom Sawyer, plan to run away and live a life of adventure. They gather supplies and make a plan to steal a raft and float down the Mississippi River. The chapter begins with Huck and Tom discussing their plan to run away. They decide to steal a raft and float down the river, in search of adventure and freedom. They gather supplies, including food, weapons, and clothing, and make a plan to sneak out of their homes at night. However, their plan is thwarted when Huck's father, Pap Finn, returns to town. Pap is an abusive and drunken man who is determined to keep Huck under his control. He locks Huck in a cabin and forbids him to leave. Huck is able to escape by faking his own death, tricking Pap into thinking he drowned in the river. Once Huck is free, he rejoins Tom and they steal the raft and set out on their journey down the river. They are excited about the adventure ahead, and Huck is particularly excited to be free from the constraints of civilization. As they float down the river, Huck and Tom encounter various obstacles and challenges. They have to avoid the dangers of the river, such as floating debris in treacherous currents, and they also have to deal with the threat of being caught by slave hunters or other authorities. Despite these challenges, Huck and Tom are determined to continue their journey. They are motivated by their desire for adventure and freedom, and they are determined to make the most of their time on the river. In Chapter 3, Huck and Tom have been on the raft for some time and they have run into some trouble. The chapter is titled A Good Going Over. At the beginning of the chapter, Huck and Tom are floating down the river on their raft, enjoying the freedom and adventure of their journey. However, they soon come across a group of men who are searching for a runaway slave, Jim. The men are suspicious of Huck and Tom and they demand to know who they are and what they are doing on the river. Huck and Tom are frightened by the men and they try to lie and deceive them in order to avoid getting caught. They tell the men that they are on a fishing trip and that they haven't seen any runaway slaves. However, the men are not convinced and they decide to search the raft and give the boys a good going over. During the search, the men find a number of items that Huck and Tom had gathered for their journey, including food, weapons, and clothing. They also find a note that Huck had written, in which he admits that they are helping Jim to escape. The men are furious when they read the note and they give Huck and Tom a good going over. They beat them and threaten to turn them in to the authorities. Huck and Tom are terrified and they are relieved when the men eventually leave without turning them in. After the men leave, Huck and Tom are shaken and bruised, but they are determined to continue their journey. They know that they have narrowly escaped being caught and they are more determined than ever to help Jim escape to freedom. In Chapter 4, Huck and Tom have recovered from their beating and continue their journey down the Mississippi River with Jim, the runaway slave they are helping to escape. The chapter is titled, "The Boys Take to the River." The chapter begins with Huck and Tom regaining consciousness after their beating by the men searching for the runaway slave, Jim. They are bruised and sore, but they are determined to continue their journey. Jim, the slave they are helping to escape, is also with them on the raft. Despite their injuries, Huck and Tom are excited to be back on the river, and they quickly get back into the rhythm of life on the raft. They fish, explore the riverbank, and enjoy the freedom and adventure of their journey. As they float down the river, Huck and Tom continue to come up with plans to help Jim escape. They come up with different schemes and disguises, trying to avoid being caught by slave hunters or other authorities. Jim is also constantly on the lookout for any signs of being pursued. However, their journey is not without its challenges. They must contend with the dangers of the river, such as floating debris and treacherous currents. They also have to deal with the threat of being caught by slave hunters or other authorities. Despite these challenges, Huck and Tom are determined to continue their journey. They are motivated by their desire to help Jim escape to freedom, and they are determined to make the most of their time on the river. In Chapter 5, Huck's abusive and drunken father, Pap Finn, reappears and tries to take Huck back home. The chapter is titled, Huck's Father. The chapter begins with Huck and Tom floating down the Mississippi River on their raft, enjoying their freedom and adventure. However, they soon come across a man in a canoe who turns out to be Huck's father, Pap Finn. Pap is drunk and abusive and he is determined to take Huck back home with him. Huck is terrified of his father and he tries to sneak away from him, but Pap is persistent and he eventually catches up with Huck. Pap is furious that Huck has been living on his own and he demands that Huck return home with him. Huck is forced to go along with his father's demands, but he is determined to escape as soon as he can. Once back at Pap's cabin, Huck is locked up and held prisoner. Pap is abusive and cruel, and he makes Huck do chores and work for him. Huck is miserable and he is determined to find a way to escape. Eventually, Huck is able to escape by faking his own death and tricking Pap into thinking he drowned in the river. Huck leaves a note behind, telling Pap that he is dead, and he sets out on his journey once again. In Chapter 6, Huck and Jim, the runaway slave they are helping to escape, continue their journey down the Mississippi River together. The chapter is titled, Huck and Jim. The chapter begins with Huck having escaped from his father's cabin and rejoining Jim on the raft. Huck is relieved to be back on the river and away from his abusive father. He and Jim continue their journey down the Mississippi River together. As they float down the river, Huck and Jim spend their time fishing, exploring the riverbank, and talking. Huck is fascinated by Jim's stories and experiences, and he is struck by the contrast between Jim's life as a slave and his own life of freedom. He begins to see Jim as a human being, rather than just a runaway slave. As Huck and Jim travel together, they begin to form a close bond. Huck starts to trust and rely on Jim, and he becomes more and more determined to help him escape to freedom. They also share many of their experiences and feelings with each other, Huck telling Jim about his abusive father and Jim about his life as a slave. However, their journey is not without its challenges. They have to contend with the dangers of the river, such as floating debris and treacherous currents. They also have to deal with the threat of being caught by slave hunters or other authorities. Despite these challenges, Huck and Jim are determined to continue their journey. They are motivated by their desire to help Jim escape to freedom, and they are determined to make the most of their time on the river. In Chapter 7, Huck and Jim come across a floating house with a dead man inside, which they initially think is a ghost. The chapter is titled, "The House of Death Floats By." The chapter begins with Huck and Jim floating down the Mississippi River on their raft, when they come across an eerie floating house. The house is empty and abandoned, but as they get closer, they find a dead man inside. The man is lying on a bed, with a bottle of poison next to him. Huck and Jim are initially terrified and they believe the house to be haunted. They are convinced that the dead man is a ghost and they are afraid to stay in the house. They quickly leave the house and continue on their journey down the river. As they float down the river, Huck and Jim discuss the strange floating house and the dead man they found inside. They speculate about who the man was and why he had killed himself. Huck is deeply affected by the experience and he reflects on the finality of death and the fragility of life. Despite the eerie and unsettling experience, Huck and Jim continue on their journey down the river. They are determined to help Jim escape to freedom and they are motivated by their desire to make the most of their time on the river. In Chapter 8, Huck and Jim come across an abandoned house on the riverbank that they believe to be haunted. The chapter is titled, "A Haunted House." The chapter begins with Huck and Jim floating down the Mississippi River on their raft, when they come across an abandoned house on the riverbank. They decide to stop and investigate the house, and as they approach, they hear strange noises coming from inside. They become convinced that the house is haunted, and they are afraid to go inside. Despite their fear, Huck and Jim eventually decide to enter the house. Inside, they find that the house is empty and abandoned, and the strange noises they had heard were caused by rats. Huck and Jim are relieved to find that the house is not haunted, but they are still uneasy about staying there. As they spend the night in the abandoned house, Huck and Jim reflect on the eerie experience and the idea of ghosts and hauntings. Huck is particularly affected by the experience and he reflects on the idea of the supernatural and how it can be used to manipulate and control people. Despite the eerie experience, Huck and Jim continue on their journey down the river, determined to help Jim escape to freedom. They are motivated by their desire to make the most of their time on the river. In Chapter 9, Huck and Jim come across a group of men who are torturing a slave and are forced to intervene. The chapter is titled, "A Sound of Diabolical Torture." The chapter begins with Huck and Jim floating down the Mississippi River on their raft, when they hear a loud, anguished cry coming from the riverbank. They investigate and discover a group of men who are brutally whipping a slave. The slave is tied to a tree, and the men are taking turns whipping him, while the slave screams in agony. Huck and Jim are horrified by the scene, and they are forced to intervene. Huck devises a plan to distract the men and free the slave. He pretends to be a lost and confused traveler, and he manages to distract the men long enough for Jim to free the slave and escape. As they continue on their journey down the river, Huck and Jim reflect on the brutal scene they had witnessed. Huck is deeply affected by the experience and he reflects on the inhumanity of slavery and the terrible treatment of slaves. He also reflects on the power of human compassion and the importance of standing up against injustice. Despite the traumatic experience, Huck and Jim continue on their journey down the river, determined to help Jim escape to freedom. They are motivated by their desire to make the most of their time on the river, and their determination to help others in need. In Chapter 10, Huck is torn between his moral beliefs and his loyalty to society as he struggles with the decision of whether or not to turn Jim in. The chapter is titled, "Huck's Decision." The chapter begins with Huck and Jim continuing their journey down the Mississippi River on their raft. As they travel, Huck begins to feel guilty about helping Jim escape and he starts to question the morality of his actions. Huck is torn between his moral beliefs, which tell him that it is wrong to keep Jim in slavery, and his loyalty to society, which dictates that he should turn Jim in. Huck is plagued by guilt and he starts to have nightmares about getting caught and punished for helping Jim escape. He starts to think that he should turn Jim in, and he even goes so far as to write a letter to Miss Watson, Jim's owner, revealing Jim's location. However, Huck's moral beliefs ultimately prevail, and he tears up the letter and decides not to turn Jim in. Huck realizes that he cannot betray Jim, who has become his friend, and that helping him escape is the right thing to do. Huck also reflects on the hypocrisy of society's laws and beliefs, which allow the mistreatment of slaves. In Chapter 11, Huck and Jim come across a traveling circus and decide to stop and check it out. The chapter is titled The Ferris Wheel. The chapter begins with Huck and Jim floating down the Mississippi River on their raft. They come across a circus that has set up camp on the riverbank and decide to stop and check it out. Huck is excited to see all the sights and sounds of the circus, and he and Jim enjoy the various performances. While at the circus, Huck and Jim come across a group of men who are trying to cheat a young boy out of his prize money from a shooting gallery. Huck and Jim intervene and help the boy keep his prize money. They also meet a group of traveling performers who are looking for a new member to join their group, and Huck and Jim decide to stay and watch the show. However, Huck soon becomes disillusioned with the circus and he starts to see the performers as frauds and phonies. He also reflects on how the circus is a distraction from the reality of life and how it's designed to entertain and distract people from their troubles. Despite his disappointment with the circus, Huck and Jim continue on their journey down the river, determined to help Jim escape to freedom. They are motivated by their desire to make the most of their time on the river, and their determination to help others in need. In Chapter 12, Huck and Jim come across a group of men who are searching for Jim and are forced to confront their own prejudices and biases. The chapter is titled The Burden of Proof. The chapter begins with Huck and Jim floating down the Mississippi River on their raft, when they come across a group of men who are searching for a runaway slave. The men are offering a reward for the capture of the slave, and Huck and Jim realize that the slave they are searching for is Jim. Huck and Jim are forced to confront their own prejudices and biases as they try to figure out what to do. Huck is torn between his desire to protect Jim and his fear of getting caught and punished. Jim is also worried about getting caught and he is willing to turn himself in to protect Huck. The men approach the raft and question Huck and Jim about the whereabouts of the runaway slave. Huck is put in the position of having to prove that Jim is not the runaway slave they are searching for. Huck and Jim both know that if they're caught, they'll be punished severely, and Huck's fear and guilt intensifies. In the end, Huck is able to prove that Jim is not the runaway slave they are searching for, by lying and saying that Jim is his uncle and had been sick. The men believe Huck's story and move on, leaving Huck and Jim relieved and grateful for their narrow escape. The chapter concludes with Huck and Jim reflecting on the experience and the power of prejudice and bias. They also reflect on the importance of standing up for what is right, even in the face of fear and danger. In Chapter 13, Huck and Jim come across a religious camp meeting and Huck is exposed to different forms of religious fervor and beliefs. The chapter is titled The Camp Meeting. The chapter begins with Huck and Jim floating down the Mississippi River on their raft, when they come across a religious camp meeting on the riverbank. Huck is curious about the camp meeting and decides to go ashore to check it out. He is exposed to different forms of religious fervor and beliefs as he observes the various preachers and converts. Huck is initially skeptical of the religious fervor he witnesses, but as he watches the converts give testimonials and be saved, he starts to feel a sense of longing and is tempted to join in. However, Huck ultimately decides not to convert, feeling that the religion is not genuine and that the preachers are more interested in getting people to convert than in truly helping them. Huck and Jim also come across a group of men who are searching for a runaway slave, and they are forced to hide and evade the men in order to protect Jim. This experience furthers Huck's understanding of the consequences of slavery and the dangers that Jim faces as a runaway slave. The chapter concludes with Huck and Jim continuing on their journey down the river, with Huck reflecting on the various forms of religious fervor he witnessed and the dangers they face as they try to help Jim escape to freedom. In Chapter 14, Huck and Jim reach the end of their journey and Huck has to make a difficult decision. The chapter is titled Conclusion. The chapter begins with Huck and Jim approaching the end of their journey down the Mississippi River. Huck is unsure of what to do next, as he has grown close to Jim and does not want to turn him in. However, Huck also feels guilty for helping Jim escape and knows that he will be punished if he is caught. Huck decides to confront his conscience and writes a letter to Miss Watson, Jim's former owner, telling her that he has Jim and that she can come and get him. Huck plans to leave the letter at the Phelps farm, where they are headed next. When they reach the Phelps farm, Huck discovers that Jim has already been freed and that Miss Watson had died, freeing Jim in her will. Huck is relieved and overjoyed to learn that Jim is free, and they celebrate their safe arrival and freedom. The chapter concludes with Huck reflecting on his journey and the lessons he has learned. Huck has grown and matured during his time with Jim, and he has come to realize that slavery is wrong and that he wants to do something about it. Huck says goodbye to Jim and decides to leave the area to start a new life, free from the prejudices and biases of the past. Thanks for listening to today's episode of BookTube. We hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like and subscribe to our channel. We have many more classic books to come. Leave a comment and let us know what you thought of today's episode, and don't forget to share our channel with your friends and family. They too can enjoy the timeless literature of the past through our immersive audio experiences. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next episode of BookTube Audio.